Hi everybody, this is Dr. Carolyn Sanders and I am here to give you our first feedback video of the session. As I'm sure you have figured out by this point in the class, this class is a little different than the other ones you've taken. The input is different and the output is different, and the whole entire content of the course is probably different than anything you've ever done before, because research, is kind of a once or twice in a lifetime kind of a project. It's not something you do all the time. So since it is more of a difficult topic, I try to be really liberal and really specific with my feedback. And what I do is I make these informal videos to kind of go over the common misconceptions and the common mistakes that are being made. So like I said, this is a very informal video. I'm not even pretending that it is formal. It's just kind of like, a conversation that we would be having if we were in person or if we were in a classroom. So there may be a lot of pauses, there may be a lot of ums. Just bear with me and we'll try to get through this the best we can. So the topic of this video is the concept of assumptions and limitations. So starting with assumptions, it has been said that assumptions are so basic that without them, the research problem itself could not exist. So assumptions are actually beliefs about the variables, and assumptions are things that are so basic that we just assume them to be true, and we usually don't even think about them. Kind of like pulling up to a stoplight. You assume that the other lane has green and they're going to go. If you pull up to a green light, you assume that everyone else is going to be stopped. These are just assumptions that we make. We don't even necessarily think about them. And generally speaking, the reason that we call it an assumption is because there's no concrete way to really test what the assumption assumes. By now, I'm sure you've gotten the point that everything in this paper needs to be fact-based, research-based, and citable. So now I'm telling you to assume things? It does make sense if you look at the examples. These are examples of assumptions. In your study, if you are giving a survey or an interview, it is assumed that people will answer honestly. There is not really a way to test if they're answering honestly. We just have to assume it. You also have to assume that the population that you have chosen is representative of the larger population. And really, we know that that's not true. We know that our small classroom or our small district is not going to represent every school district or every classroom or even, the nation as a whole. But just for the purposes of making this project work, we just have to assume that the population that you have chosen is representative of the larger population. We also have to assume that any effects noted are the result of the treatment that you have provided and cannot be attributed to any other factors. When we're talking about classroom implementation, there are so many factors that influence the outcome, whether it be achievement, behavior, what have you. We have to assume that any changes are the result of the treatment. Here's an example. A teacher is going to start implementing a one-to-one program. And we have two children over here who are so low achieving, and it's because they are constantly talking, goofing off, playing around. So their achievement, let's just say, is at a 0. She decides to move their chairs. She's going to move them to different sides of the classroom and implement one-to-one at the same time. Well, all of a sudden, these children go off the charts. Their achievement's amazing. They're also behaving at the same time. They're learning now. They're engaged. We can't, for the purpose of the study, we can't analyze every single factor that influenced the children's achievement or behavior or whatever. We have to say, I'm studying one-to-one implementation, and so whatever happens is a result of the one-to-one. Hopefully that makes sense. But if we move on to this one, it might make a little more sense. But we also have to assume that any external measuring tools that we're using, standardized testing, MAP testing, ACT, SAT, iReady tests, whatever kind of measures are already existing, we have to assume that they're accurate and they're valid assessments and that they measure what they claim to measure. And why is that an assumption? You may think, well, companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to validate their tests. If you're in a Missouri district right now, you understand that, sometimes the guarantees of validity are not worth the paper they're written on. If you're not from Missouri, our Algebra 1 and English 2 high school and of course exams were just judged to be invalid. So, we can't use the scores for adequate yearly progress or anything like that. Literally hundreds of thousands of dollars went into developing this test and developing the validity of the test. Now it's invalid. But for the purpose of our study, we just have to say we're going to assume that whatever test we're using is accurate. So as you go back over your paper, as we move on, what are some of the premises that absolutely must be true for your study to be valid? Are you giving an external test? Are you implementing a treatment that really could be influenced by other factors, like snow days, for example? If you're doing kind of a snapshot kind of a project where you go into a classroom maybe 6 or 7 times to assess behaviors, and one day they are like wild, bouncing off the walls. Maybe it was, the day before Christmas break. You can't, we just have to assume that whatever's happening in the classroom or the district is a result of what we are doing, because otherwise there would be too many factors to list of, what could be. And then moving on to limitations. Limitations are factors that threaten the transferability of the implications of your study to larger populations. So let's just say that in your study, your hypothesis ends up being true. But a limitation would be, why might your hypothesis not be true for other groups? What factors might make your study not applicable to other groups? And here are examples of limitations. Scientifically speaking, even if you study an entire district, we're still dealing with a small sample size. And if we move down to individual classrooms or individual grade levels, it's even smaller. And as you know, the smaller the sample size, the less reliable your results. So the small sample size is definitely a limitation. And then the short duration of treatment is a limitation. Oftentimes these scientific studies or educational research studies have taken place for years, and our duration simply is not that long. So we don't have a very big snapshot to compare our data to, so that's why it's a limitation. Another limitation is the nature of self-reporting. As you know, humans are wildly inaccurate about their perceptions of themselves. Just for example, in my dissertation, I surveyed students and teachers their self-reported abilities to complete certain tasks, and then I compared their answers. Students say they do it this well, teachers say they do it this well. And invariably, some students wildly overestimated their capabilities to do certain things. So a limitation is just the nature of self-reporting. There's nothing that we can do about it. Another example of a limitation would be teacher training levels. Let's say you're comparing 2 different classrooms, where you're going to have 2 different teachers, 2 different learning styles. You may have a seasoned, veteran, master teacher in one classroom, and then you may have a struggling teacher in the other classroom. Teacher training levels are certainly going to influence whatever treatment you are providing to the groups. Administrative support can be a limitation, definitely. One district, if the administrator is all on board with a certain treatment or a certain program, but then in another school, that administrator does not believe in that philosophy at all, that would be a limitation. And then just basic differences in the level of rigor. Let's say you're comparing grades like A, B, C, D, F, or you're comparing GPA or what have you. Individual differences in rigor, whether it be course content, grading policies, what have you, those are limitations. We have these differences that we can't control among these different teachers, grade levels, districts, what have you. If one school is really, really, really simple, those students are going to have much higher GPAs or much higher scores than a school who is extremely rigorous. And then oftentimes policies can make a huge difference on the outcome of your study from one district compared to the other. If grading policies are different, if discipline policies are different, we all know that classroom management and discipline definitely has an influence on what can take place in the classroom. So, just the differences in these levels can make a difference in the implementation of your studies. And then different schedules, the differences between the traditional 9-month calendar and the year-round calendar, or schedules. Let's say I'm going to conduct my study in the fall semester when students are still fairly new. The results might be different in the spring semester because the students are, a little older, a little more mature, and they've had a little bit more exposure to the content. And then obviously the level of implementation with treatment would be a limitation. If one teacher is just absolutely all about it, I'm going all in, and then another teacher, oh yeah, I was supposed to be doing that, that's going to make a difference. So going forward on the limitations, what are some of the factors that may affect how your results would apply to other groups or schools or populations? You don't have to be specific with examples. You don't have to say, my administration is very much in favor of this policy, and so I have complete administrative support. I receive lots of professional development. You don't have to go into all those details. You can just say, levels of administrative support, if that applies to your study, things like that. You don't have to be all that specific with details. Just say, these are the factors that could limit the transferability. And then you get a bonus lesson. Affect and effect. Sound the same, spell different, mean different things. Affect with an A is a verb, and it means to influence, to have an effect on something. And then effect with an E is a noun, and it means a result. So the effect of the treatment would be with an E. Or if you were to say, will this affect the treatment, would be an A. Or what is the effect of the treatment would be E. Does that make sense? That in the first example, there was no the, and I was using effect as a verb, sorry. And then in the second one, I was using effect as a noun. So, going forward on all this, if you have any questions, if this is just not making sense, please contact me. I can point you to some pages in your text. I can point you to some other websites or other resources, or I can try to explain it to you the best I can. My hope is that with these informal videos, and again, I do not profess them to be professional. They're just our fast, I need to get this information out there to you quickly, so it's done in 20 minutes. But I hope that you can, really learn from them, and really you can take these examples and you can try to think, how does this apply to my paper? What else might work in my paper? And then you can really have a good result on it. So again, if you have any questions, please ask. Thank you, and have a great rest of the week.